Good afternoon, everybody. We're really excited to be here with all 80 of you. And this webinar has been many months in the planning. So we are excited to have you all in one space with us. Again, my name is Monica Cordova. I work at the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing. And before we start, I think it's good for us to just do a couple of collective deep breaths to center us as we get into the content for today. So folks will indulge me in sitting upright if you're sitting, and to the extent that you can, and taking 3 deep breaths. Thank you all. I appreciate that. So for today, we want to dig in a little bit on why you're all here. So for the agenda, what we're hoping to do is, one, clearly articulate the purpose of the Youth Power Lab and the important role young people are playing in organizing movements in this moment. We'll be having our leadership team, which is our partnership with groups on the ground, really talk about some of the ways in which the points of alignment that we developed as a crew together are grounded in their own experiences and critical to this process. And we want you all as participants in the webinar to also reflect on the points of alignment that we're going to share, how they connect to your own work. And then of course, the lab is a process that is not just a convening, but a process that will launch next year. And so we're hoping to clearly outline that process as well as the way in which you can apply for the lab. So that's what the next 90 minutes will be. We're hoping to make it as interactive and engaging as possible while getting the appropriate information out. So before we really get into it, Hashim, do you want to reveal the very important poll results?
Yes, I would be happy to. Let me stop sharing my screen. All right. So it looks like the vast majority of people on the call today are coming from youth organizing groups. And almost half of folks are from the Northeast. And a plurality of people prefer apple pie as the best holiday pie, but there's no clear majority. So that tells us a little bit about who's on this call today. Thank you, everybody, for participating in my silly little poll.
Thanks, Hashim. And then before we actually get into the content of the agenda, we also wanted to provide just a few minutes for you all to connect with each other. So what we're going to wind up doing is breaking you all up into pairs. And in those pairs, we just want you to spend a few minutes sharing, of course, your name, organization, and then why is organizing young people important to building strong social movements. So again, in your pairs, and will you drop that question in the chat, Mona? Again, we're going to break into pairs. Please share your name, organization with your partner, and share why organizing young people is important to building strong social movements.
And we're actually going to do groups of 3 on that.
Oh, groups of 3. Even better. You get to meet 2 more people. All right. Are we ready to do the breakout? Let's get to it. Partners and allies in youth organizing. And over, the course of, I think in particular, the last 5 years, we've been having a lot of conversations, a lot more conversations that were really centering around questions of power and what it meant to build meaningful power. So then as we began to think about our 20th anniversary that will be coming up next year in 2020, we began to plan our national youth organizing convening. And to do that, we put out a survey and asked the field to nominate folks from the field to be on our planning team. And then also to opt in to, throw their hat in their city, their organization as our host. So through that process, we put together what we call our national planning team, which consists of 22 youth organizations across the country. And we also decided on Miami, Florida, in our partnership with FCYO, Dream Defenders, and folks out in Florida. And then we developed a smaller leadership team to try to dig into the agenda. So at our first meeting in Miami earlier this year in March, I think as FCYO entered into this space, we really thought about, we're going to have a convening of hundreds of young folks. Like, we want to bring, it's our 20th, we're going to go big, we're going to bring together as many groups as possible, and had a really great conversation with the folks from the field in the room. And we're, raising questions of, in this moment, is a massive convening where folks come together and maybe connect on very surface level really necessary, or do we need a smaller space that is more strategic? And so I think what the themes that kept arising during that meeting was, what is needed in this moment was a smaller strategic space for folks to really dig into conversations of power and strategy. And so we shifted our orientation to how we were thinking about our convening. As we continued to build with our leadership team and think about the agenda, we really wanted that space to be a true partnership and really, grapple with big questions around how we're aligning, how we're defining power, and what kind of space will facilitate the types of conversations that are necessary to help the youth organizing field do what we call level up, step into the moment in 2020, even a lot stronger. And so as that began to evolve, we realized that we weren't planning a convening. What we were planning is a strategic initiative, a strategic process in which we can build together in a different way. And so hence the Youth Power Lab, because we wanted to put a different framework on what we were actually entering into, that it wasn't a convening, but it is a process of grappling with big questions of power. And so, Hashim, I think we're probably on the next slide. So what is the purpose of the lab? Those are pictures from our March meeting. First, we want to articulate a clear framework for the strategic role youth organizing plays in building transformative social movements. So I think it was really critical to understand why youth organizing. I think, and that's partly why we asked the opening question, is why? What is the role young people play in social movements? And let's get really kind of clear about what that is and why that's really important in this moment. And two, to develop assessments of the core strengths and growth edges of the youth organizing and discuss key interventions that are needed to build greater power. So, I come out of youth organizing. I was at the Southwest Organizing Project in Albuquerque, New Mexico for 10 years and did some really amazing work, but also kind of left some of that work, right, questioning how we can do things that are really more strategic and build power in a different way. And so I think as it relates to youth organizing, many of the groups we were in conversation with were also asking that question, questions about base and scale, about strategic alliances, about how kind of one campaign intersects to build a much longer term strategy to really gain control of community conditions. And then last, if we get clear on the first two things, is there a way in which we can launch experiments to test new approaches to power building across geographies, issues, and constituencies? So, as this process plays out, are there new things that we're oh, that's an interesting idea, I want to try that out, I want to shift some of my practice? can we test some experiments to jointly learn and grow from each other around like what's working, what isn't working, what are some of the things that we can really dig into in a different way. Next slide, I think. So then, you know, as I mentioned before, the Youth Power Lab is a process. So one, it's going to consist of a pre-gathering, which will be online sessions, webinars, and selected studies. So the groups that come into this process, we're hoping will really fully participate in the webinars and the study, so that then when we land into the national gathering in Miami, May 14th to 17th, folks are already in conversation and relationship and have been grappling with some of the questions pre-hand, so we can have a much deeper conversation in person. And then three, you know, shared experiments. We don't know what those are going to look like. We don't know what that container is going to be at this moment, because we want to be in praxis with the field to help think about that and design it. And so, you know, it'll be post that we'll want to lean into our relationships with folks that are a part of the process to really define what that could look like, how that's getting held. And while this is not, the lab is not a grant making initiative, I know some folks' relationship to FCYO is through that. This is, again, like a strategic initiative, but we do hope to leverage some dollars to potentially fund some of the experiments that move forward. The other thing we're clear about is that some folks may engage in the steps 1 and 2 and then decide like they're not ready, or the shared experiment process isn't for them. And that is completely fine. You know, we hope that we're building a group of folks that are ready to kind of be in a different praxis with each other, but we also kind of understand that you kind of, as you enter into this process, you can't sign up fully for something that you don't know what it is yet.
And before we go on, Monica, just one quick thing to name. These slides will be made available and emailed out to everyone who's on the call today, as well as a link to the recording if you want to watch it or share with other people in your organization or partner organizations. And we're going to be kind of closing the program, so to speak, of the webinar at 3:30, and we will stay on for an additional 30 minutes from 3:30 to 4 for Q&A. So if you have particular questions as we're going through this, we're not going to be stopping for questions, but just please make note of those questions. And then there's also a place to ask follow-up questions in the evaluation.
Thanks, Hashim, for clarifying that. Oh, and in the picture, that's some of our national planning team in the Miami water. I'm from New Mexico. Connection to the elements is really important. So if you needed more reason to want to hang with us, go ahead and go to the next slide, Hashim. So again, as we worked with, oh, and we missed the slide that, can you go back to the slide that shows who our leadership team is really quickly? We missed this slide. So, so this is the crew we've been rocking with over the last few months. FCYO, Center for Social Change, Poder en Acción in Arizona, Youth United for Change in Philly, Dream Defenders in Florida, and Alliance for Educational Justice. So just so you know who's kind of been grappling with a lot of this in a very deep way, as well as we have a much larger national planning team. Okay, go ahead and move forward. So as we began to think about this process, we really wanted to, you know, define some parameters around who this, you know, who should enter into this process to help you all think about if this is for you and your organization. So one, we really want groups to be base building organizations with an explicit commitment to anti-racism and a praxis of running grassroots organizing campaigns. So kind of both the intersection of building base, running campaigns, and an analysis around race and class. Two, for folks to share power with youth in critical organizational decision-making processes that center young people of color or working class young people. So, you know, we know a variety of organizations engage young people in different way. And, you know, there's really important, there's really a lot of importance in mentorship and leadership development, but we're really looking for youth-led organizations or youth organizing institutions that actually share leadership with their young people. A commitment to grappling with questions of effective power building strategies and the scale needed to shift conditions at local, state, and national levels. So again, like if you haven't noticed from much of what I've said, we're really talking about power building. And that just means that there's going to be some tough conversations and big conversations. And then next, be willing to be honest and vulnerable about the strengths and limitations of their current and historical approaches to organizing and organizational models. So this is a space, we hope to really create a space and a container for folks to be honest. You know, like I said, I was in organizing. I know oftentimes we enter into spaces and for a variety of reasons, for wanting to show strength, for reasons connected to resourcing, we really kind of puff out our chest and really show our shine and don't always step into our vulnerability. So we want folks to be able to be honest about what they're struggling with. Like, I do this really great, but actually this is a strategy that we struggle with internally, and dig into those in a real way. Have a commitment to at least one organizational leader defined as somebody who has significant decision-making power or influence within your organization, fully participate in the Miami gathering as well as the pre-gathering virtual sessions. So another thing that we've learned kind of through our intersections with organizations is that it's really important, if we're talking about making shifts in organizational strategies and models, that having a decision maker within the organization participate in the process is really critical, because sometimes folks can have a really great idea, and then because their leadership hasn't been engaged in the process, they kind of go back and report back, and maybe it doesn't land right, and maybe it doesn't get moved. So we're hoping to really engage folks, at least one of the participants, somebody who can actually really make decisions in the organization. Next is be open to engaging in shared experiments following the lab. So again, you know, we're not saying you have to do the experiments, but we're saying, you know, there's enter with an intent of openness to think differently and maybe do something differently. And then also be willing and able to shift current base building, leadership development, and campaign development methodologies to improve youth organizing. So again, we're interested in creating a cohort that is actually like, oh, there are some things that I might be able to shift or do differently. And so we want folks to engage at that level. So I'm going to pause for a second, and actually I wanted to bring in somebody from our leadership team just to, from an organizational perspective, reflect on all of what I just shared. So Raphael Randall, who is the ED at Youth United for Change. Raphael, if you don't mind sharing some of your thoughts about kind of our process to getting here, and any of the criteria or things that we've just talked about.
Yeah. Hey, folks. So, you know, that criteria came out of hours and hours of dialogue amongst the leadership team, trying to really create a space where we can avoid the cliches that a lot of us are accustomed to experiencing in convenings or spaces deemed as convenings, and really try to create a space that moves not only our individual organizations forward, but the sector as a whole. And, you know, I can talk at length about a number of those criteria, but I really want to focus on the criteria that outlines the importance of being vulnerable and open to sharing kind of the shortcomings of our organizations and organizational models and experiments. So a lot of us kind of in this sector, you know, at YUC, we've been wrestling with this for years, but a lot of us in this sector have really been trained by the nonprofit industrial complex to always put our best face forward, to participate in a dog and pony show as a method to keep these organizations, which have real importance to our specific communities and groups, keep them afloat in a steady state, right? So, you know, being vulnerable and actually talking about the shortcomings of our orgs could leave us susceptible to being defunded by funders who don't share our political vision or thinking. We're more oriented around kind of short-term policy victories. And I just think also too, from a social and emotional aspect, it's really hard to be open and vulnerable, because sometimes that can reveal our high levels of underdevelopment politically, but also just relative ineffectiveness. Our ability to win policies is great, but implementation seems to be a consistent problem for a number of us in the field. However, if you look at it in contrast, right, this tenuous relationship to vulnerability and being open about weaknesses actually flies in the face of practices that we've seen carried out by revolutionary leaders and projects around the world throughout history, who placed a high premium on concrete analysis and actually being real about our weaknesses as a means to correct them and continue to advance forward. And so if we're really serious about power, and we're really serious about honoring those ancestors and kind of mimicking in certain ways their paths to victories, then it's important that we take a different orientation towards vulnerability and step into that. If we're to ever build not just viable individual left youth organizing projects, but also a vibrant liberatory popular force that can actually bring about the type of change we all want to see occur, not only in the US, but abroad.
Thanks, Raphael. Appreciate that context. Hashim, do you want to move to the next slide?
Yes, I'm trying to. There we go.
Okay. So just, again, to reiterate, we're going to, this will be up for folks to view both this webinar as well as the PowerPoint on our website. So if you're wondering at this point how to apply, we have a website called youthpowerlab.net. And so if you're like at this point, yes, this is something that I think will be really useful, I'm really down with what you're talking about, and we're going to continue to even dig a little deeper after this, and you're wondering how to apply, if you go to youthpowerlab.net after the webinar, everything will be up there. There's going to be 3 sections to the application process, which is essentially a Google form, and you can also download the instructions if you want to work on it as you go. One section will ask for basic organizational information. The second section will ask a series of spectrum questions to see kind of where you agree, where you disagree, and any reflections on those. And then section 3 is 2 narrative questions that you can either submit in written form, audio form, or through video. So, and just to put a little bit more kind of context and parameters around that, when we said smaller, more strategic convening, we're still looking at probably around 70 groups. So, and we're really looking for a mix right within that of groups by issue, geography, folks that are working with high school age young folks to folks that are working with young adults. So within that, we're going to be taking a particular kind of cut to it that will allow for a variety of voices to connect in a particular way. And then if you go to the next slide, Hashim, for the timeline. And so as we think about the application process, so again, it's launching today, November 6th. Applications are due December 20th. And then the leadership team will engage in a process of reviewing them. And based on both the criteria and that kind of geographic issue constituency cut, making some decisions on who gets in. Folks will be notified in early February if you've made it into the Youth Power Lab. And then the virtual sessions and study will start in March through early May. And then in May is the convening. And then in summer, we hope to launch experimentations or a kind of continued joint learning process. And so that's the kind of history baseline. Hopefully you all were able to retain some of what I just laid out. And now what we actually would love to do is to really dig into some of the ways in which we're thinking and grappling about these questions. So I'm going to kick it over to Hashim to really dig into the points of alignment.
Great, thank you, Monica. The information I'm gonna go over now is also on that website, the powerlab.net. There's a section that says points of alignment. So similar to the criteria where Raphael said, the leadership team lab spent hours kind of thinking through what kinds of groups and what do we want groups stepping into and being willing to step into to be able to engage together through this lab. We similarly spent many hours of conversation talking about what is the baseline level of alignment to be even begin having the kinds of vulnerable conversations of how we build greater power. And so what I'm about to go over now are a series of kind of 4 overarching points of alignment that we think as the leadership team kind of clearly articulate what it is we're trying to be up to. So in going back to the purpose of the lab, as Monica introduced, our hope with this is that through this process, we can kind of further consolidate people within the youth organizing field around what is it going to take for us to really take a significant step forward as a field to build a more powerful social movement in the US, and what are those key interventions. And so the first part, we've been talking a lot about power, and that's really central to this. So we use this framework of the power to win. And by that, what we mean is the power to actually transform economic and social conditions for our communities and for society as a whole. So it's about more than just winning policy changes, but it's about being willing to being able to advance an agenda that actually shifts material conditions structurally for our people. And in order to do that, we have this analysis that means we have to gain power both inside and outside of key decision-making bodies. That means we have to be willing to contest for governance and be in a position where our movements are actually the people who are making decisions. And we have probably all had the experience of what happens when we get sucked into the inside of governance and we lose that leverage that actually gives us power to make sure that decision makers are held accountable. So when we talk about a transformative kind of power, it's both being able to be the decision makers while also being, as a movement, able to maintain that outside presence to make sure that those governing processes are held accountable to our interests and our agenda. Getting to that level of power means we really need to grapple with this question of scale in a significant way. Many of our organizations function at the level of dozens or maybe hundreds, but we really need to be thinking in terms of tens of thousands and millions and really fighting for contesting for geography and territory at a really big scale in order to get to that kind of power. And it also means that we need to be able to build alliances outside of our core constituencies. So what are the united fronts? What are the strategic blocks of forces that we need to build with as youth organizations? And by alliances, we mean more than just like other groups like us that represent constituencies like us. It means also learning what it's like to build a political force with people that we don't necessarily always agree with, but maybe have some political objectives that are in alignment with one another. And then finally, building the power to win is about uplifting liberatory narratives, right? So it's about advancing our vision of what the world should look like through our political work and really contesting for what is common sense. And I think there are some really beautiful examples of how our movements have done that. Black Lives Matter immediately comes to mind, but that doesn't just happen automatically. It has to be integrated into our strategies. So the first point of alignment is that when we talk about power, what we're talking about is the power to transform, and this is what we mean by the power to win. The second point of alignment relates to the specific role of young people. And so I'm just going to read this statement. We are living through a pivotal historical moment, and young people from oppressed communities have a decisive role to play in our struggle for liberation. So this is a point of analysis to Monica's earlier point about what is the point of organizing young people. I think for me, I came up as an organizer working with adults and then came into youth organizing after I had already been organizing for 5 or 6 years. So I didn't automatically understand what was the point of organizing young people. And I think we need to be able to say that this is not just organizing young people because young people are great, which they are, and because it's really inspiring to work with young people, which it is, but what's actually the strategic role of young people in our movements? And we talk about this current moment, I think we all live this, since the economic crash of 2008, there has been this opening in our society where the dominance of the neoliberal order has broken down and the new dominant order has yet to shape. And that has created a lot of exciting political openings and opportunities. So if we think about again, the Black Lives Matter movement. We think about the Dreamers movement. We think about the advances that have been made in queer liberation, the challenge to capitalism that has been taking the form of the Occupy movement and the energy around the Bernie Sanders campaign and others. There's all of these indications that the country is ripe for major steps forward in terms of political transformation. And at the same time, in that opening, there are really dire threats in the form of Trumpism and everything that that politics represents. We think about the continued dominance of big capital, you know, representative figures like the Koch brothers. We think about what happened in Charlottesville and the growth of white nationalism in this country. So we're in this really critical period where over the course of the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, what happens with our struggles, whether we win or lose, has the potential to reverberate for many generations. And we at FCYO believe that there's a particular role for young people to play in that struggle for liberation. And we need to be clear around what are those strategic roles of young people in building those kinds of transformative social movements. So the U.S. field of youth organizing, we believe, has to level up in the areas of strategy and movement infrastructure in order to contest for the power needed to win. So if we're going to seize this moment and seize the opportunities that are there for us, we believe there are some key growth edges that we need to wrestle with within youth organizing. The first one is that we think we need more of our groups to really think about the question of long-term strategy, and not just kind of what's the next policy fight and short-term victories, but what's the long game towards shifting the balance of forces in this country. And related to that is, again, this thing about we need to really be thinking about how we're building power, not just empowerment. So I think there is a tendency within youth organizing to emphasize the personal transformation of young people that happens through youth organizing, which is a really powerful and amazing thing. And that's not sufficient to shift conditions in our communities. So we really need to be thinking about how are we equipping, how is our organizing, again, building base at scale, building the kinds of long-term strategic alliances that we need, contesting in the war of ideas. We also, this pushes us to think about campaigns in a different way. So again, like Raphael was getting to, you know, policy fights in and of themselves is not what this is about. Obviously, we want to have positive outcomes, positive policy outcomes in our fights. But campaigns are really, we need to understand them as the vehicles through which we engage young people and bring them into the movement and kind of orient them around struggle by engaging them in the issues that directly impact them. And these campaigns are really about also training them to be grounded in this movement work for life, right? That youth organizing has this critical role to play as an on-ramp for long-term movement. And so in order to play that role, another area of growth for us to figure out is how we're building intergenerational infrastructure. I think many groups, I've had conversations with people who talk about what a challenge it is to figure out with their young people what they do when they age out of youth organizing. They spend 3-4 years with us and we have this great development that happens and then we kind of just send them off into the world and hope that they keep it going. And so we need to build more intentional relationships with organizations that work at different life stages to make sure that the development that happens while they're in youth organizing carries over to an ongoing role within their movements, whether that's as a professional organizer or a rank and file worker or a grassroots community leader or running for office or any number of other things. And then finally, this last point of alignment is around our commitment to moving forward. So we will try bold shared experiments across the field of youth organizing to test out new methods for building the power to win. So again, we want to ground ourselves in a clear understanding around the role of young people in building powerful social movements. We want to take a really close look at how are we doing in building towards that kind of liberatory youth organizing. So again, really assessing both our strengths and our growth edges. as we're identifying what are the key interventions that we think we need to make, it's not going to be enough for one organization here and one organization there to try some new things. We're actually going to have to collaborate across organizations, across constituencies, across geographies, and try out some shared experiments. And the idea here is not that we're going to kind of land on some cookie cutter approach that's going to work across the country, but can we identify what are the core methodologies and frameworks and approaches that can help us build greater power so that as a field, our work is adding up to more than the sum of its parts. So again, I know this is a lot. This is on the website, theyouthpowerlab.net. All of this is spelled out with some additional points. And I think the key thing to keep in mind is if this is resonating with you, if you're like, yes, these are the things that we need to be trying to figure out within youth organizing, then this lab might be for you. So what we're going to do now is we're going to bring in the voices of a couple more of our members of the leadership team. So Jonathan Stith from the Alliance for Educational Justice, James Lopez from the Power Youth Center for Social Change, and Rachel Gilmer from Dream Defenders. We're going to do a little panel discussion to kind of talk about the significance of these points of alignment, what really resonates with them, and how they ground that in their own experience of trying to build this movement. So Jonathan, if you could kick us off and share from your vantage point, what really resonates with you, particularly around this first point of alignment and understanding the strategic role of young people in building movements.
Absolutely. So good afternoon or good whatever type of the morning or day it is for wherever you're at. So Jonathan Stith, I'm the National Director for the Alliance for Educational Justice. AJ is a national network of about 30 youth-led and intergenerational groups that have been organizing around ending the school-to-prison pipeline. First coming together in 2008 around the start of the Obama administration, and what we saw as a political opportunity to shift federal policy, particularly around No Child Left Behind. As many of us had realized at that particular moment that a lot of our local campaigns and victories were being hampered by this mystery, zero tolerance, this insistence from local and state officials that that the federal policy was to discriminate against Black and oppressed youth. And to the question around the alignment, I think one of the things that kind of seeing the slide was really grabbed around was, again, remembering around what happened at the day after the election, when we saw kind of millions of young people pour out in protest from the high schools, calling for walkouts. The day before, we saw young people in Phoenix, Arizona, who have been organizing to get the sheriff there ousted, with Puente human rights movement in Arizona leading a walkout, and they too being part of a set of young folk that then walked out again on a second day. For me, really began to mark and understand kind of resistance and young people's critical role in playing a role of resistance in this particular political moment, as we all are trying to figure out how we move through this particular moment, understanding that this moment is actually a continuum of other movements. And that while it can also, I think there's a part of me that says like, every moment is critical, and young people, and I think part of our task is always helping young people to find, and young people finding and defining what is their critical role at this particular moment. And so whether that is, again, been historically, when we look at who ran away from slavery, it was always young people starting as early as the age of 13, to some of the examples that we've seen internationally, from Soweto in 1976 to even the walkouts or the action around the public transportation in Chile, led by high school students, that had sparked a nation to rise up, to our own experiences with Standing Rock and Ferguson, even my own experience with the assault at Spring Valley, where again, we saw young people, and particularly in the Alliance, kind of really rise up to meet a particular moment and enter into what we felt like a movement around calling for police abolition, and for them starting in their schools. And kind of working from the Asada belief that schools reflect the societies, young people beginning to ask the question, how do we change schools in order to change society? And that has been some of the work of the Alliance since 2015, has been trying to figure out how we build a robust campaign led by young people to really challenge police presence in our schools as a prelude, as a prefigurative kind of belief around a world without police, and believing that if we could win it in our schools, we could win it in the broader society. And so it almost then becomes like that Fanon quote that I hear a lot of us gets thrown around kind of every generation, that every generation out of relative obscurity has to choose its destiny and decide whether to fulfill it or betray. And I think young people are always in that constant question. And as Ella tells us, that the struggle is eternal, the tribe increases, and someone else carries on. And usually that is young people, and it's young people from our communities.
Word. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to kick it over to Rachel from Dream Defenders. And Rachel, if you could share a little bit, from your perspective as a director of Dream Defenders working with young adults, this need for long-term strategy and power, why that feels really important to move beyond just protest and activism.
Yeah, of course. And thanks so much for organizing this call and for so many people being on it. That's really exciting, because many of the kind of things that Hashim elevated Dream Defenders has really been trying to grapple with. So we're excited to be in deeper kind of learning space with folks around these questions. So Dream Defenders was founded in 2012 after the killing of Trayvon Martin. And basically students came together from across the state to plan a big march to demand justice around his murder. And then a year later, when George Zimmerman was acquitted, we took over the Florida Capitol and occupied it for 31 days and 30 nights. And we're demanding basically a special session around Stand Your Ground and the passing of Trayvon's Law, which was this like suite of legislation we had put together around the criminalization of Black youth. And, this was like before Black Lives Matter in, 2014, when we were seeing like young Black people out in the streets all the time. And when Trayvon Martin was killed, it was kind of one of the first moments, at least in my generation, where I remember seeing young Black and brown youth like protesting in mass numbers. And when Dream Defenders took over the Capitol, we like very quickly went from being an organization that nobody knew about to being pretty like kind of being surged into the national spotlight in many ways. We had celebrities joining us in the Capitol. We were, Phil, our director at the time, was getting like flown out to, speak on TV. And in many ways, we felt like, whoa, we are on the brink of winning something really, really big. And because we were like so popular, but, at the end of the 31 days, it was like very clear that like we weren't going to win anything, despite the like being really popular and being in the public view in a way that was like changing the narrative, because we actually like didn't have the power to change anything. And like when we were in the Capitol, we saw the people who like really had the power. Like it has had trifecta Republican control. So the governor's seat, the Senate, and the House have been controlled by like the far right Republicans for 20 years. We saw like the private prison lobby, like literally saw them walking around the Capitol every day, saw Marion Hammer, who's like, the person behind, she's an NRA lobbyist who's like behind the Stand Your Ground law. We saw her in the Capitol every day. And it was very clear that like those were the people who actually had the power. And despite us being popular, we couldn't get confused that meant that we had power to actually win things. And then a year later, when Mike Brown was killed, we sort of had a similar experience where like, we saw people turn this really tragic moment into like a fighting moment. And like, people in Ferguson were in the streets every day for 3 months. And at the end, Darren Wilson like still got off. And so it was like another moment in terms of just like, okay, like we're mobilizing mass amounts of people. In many ways, I think the public is with us, but we aren't actually we don't have the political power to translate that into real wins and into moving a real agenda, as Hashim said. So in that kind of moment, we decided to take a step back as an organization and go through like kind of a deep process of really thinking through strategy together and what it meant to actually figure out a long-term plan. And during that time, we also formed with like 7 other organizations in Florida to really figure out like what is a long-term path towards getting to governance, towards having people like all of us on the call actually in power and being able to move an agenda. And through that experience, we've been kind of like, kind of experimenting on different things. Like we endorsed someone for governor, we're going to endorse in the presidential election, really thinking about what is the role of elections, thinking about how do we get to scale, how do we recruit mass, a lot more people, especially in this moment when there's like so many young people who are radicalized around big ideas like socialism and eliminating student debt and prison abolition. How do we create an organizational structure that's actually able to bring those people into it and grow into the thousands? And so really excited about the lab and excited about the ability to really think about these questions with other folks grappling with them because, I think there's a lot at stake, as was said earlier, and we really need to step up in many ways as a sector and really meet the moment. And so excited to be in experimentation and discussion with other folks around how we do that.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rachel. So I'm going to bring in James now from FCYO. So James, very early on when we were talking about this process, one of the things that we named is that we want an opportunity for groups to actually like do stuff together, not just come to a convening, but actually have some practice on the back end, which would mean groups being willing to change their plans or thinking about their plans in relationship to other groups, which is, sometimes that's a push out of our comfort zone. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about why that felt particularly important for you, this idea of having an ecosystem approach and thinking about shared experiments and not just coming together, having a bunch of great conversations, and then everybody kind of goes off and figures out how to implement it by themselves.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Hashim. Hey, y'all, I'm James. Just have a lot of appreciation for y'all being on the call. You could be anywhere in the world, but y'all are talking to us for a 2-hour conversation on a Zoom call. So a lot of gratitude around that. So kind of where we enter this conversation, FCYO, at least for almost the past decade, has been an organization based in the city of Miami that's committed to developing the working class leadership of Black and Brown youth, particularly around issues related to the school to prison pipeline and reproductive justice. And why we're really excited about this particular project and why we're thinking about our work in relationship to the ecosystem as an organization who sort of is really hyper-focused on developing high schoolers to organize is because, for almost the past decade, our organization kind of came out of the tradition of the school to prison pipeline fights, particularly around the fight to implement restorative justice. And for a while, our work was pressuring and trying to get the superintendent of Miami-Dade County and the school board to end out of school suspensions and to actually implement alternatives such as restorative justice and investing in restorative justice practitioners. And kind of what happened is, that was almost a 7-8 year fight where the superintendent then went on national television and sort of announced that he was sort of end out of school suspensions and announced the sort of implementation of this innovative alternative system called Success Centers. And we were super excited because, it was a big moment where something that we were fighting for such a long time was actually a quote unquote win, right? Like it looked really sparkly. Folks were like, shout out to FCYO for sort of beating the drum and doing the work, and then as that was in 2015. Fast forward to 2019, the restorative justice project within the school district has yet to be implemented to fidelity. Our organization, which was seen as a radical group that was a group of rabble rousers, was forced out of the implementation process or the decision making related to that. And also organizationally, because that campaign took 7-8 years, it actually outlasted the average life cycle of a high school member in our organization. So what happened is the majority of the people who had the campaign experience, who had the understanding of how systems work, were paid staff. And we saw that in relationship to philanthropy and nonprofits, that sort of said, that's actually normal. That is the way things are. Usually paid staff are the people who do sort of like the behind the scenes wheeling and dealing. And then you get young people to maybe turn up in the street or be really good at telling their personal story. And we see that as grossly insufficient of actually building long-term power, because, you know, our partners in Miami and nationally who organize more quote unquote adult folks say, you know, it's really hard to find people who have concrete base building and organizing experience, right? Or like most of the people who are actually getting concrete organizing skills or getting trained up comes after they've were invested in through some sort of fellowship in college, or like an actual paid staff first-time position as an organizer within a nonprofit. And for us, we see that there's a very clear leadership gap around that, particularly of working class Black folks and brown folks, actually having concrete base building experience, actually learning how to think about strategy and actually understanding campaigns. And it made us recognize that even if our organization grows to scale, which we want to do, right? Like even if we had the ability to have Power U chapters up and down the state of Florida, it actually is not enough power that is really going to change conditions for our communities and our schools. And I think even a great anecdotal example is, regardless of how folks feel about it, you know, we March for Our Lives and sort of the Parkland moment happened a couple miles north of here. And that sort of sparked a lot of national media attention. There were millions of young people who were being mobilized. And, you know, there was a sort of famous CNN town hall where the Parkland students are asking Marco Rubio, hey, can you denounce that? Are you going to no longer take money from the NRA or the National Rifle Association? And there's just so much pressure in the room. People are booing him. And he's kind of like a no-brainer. Absolutely not, right? I'm not taking money. I'm going to continue to take money from the NRA. And everybody sort of booed him. Like the Parkland students sort of tweeted all this thing. And like the public sentiment was sort of criticizing Marco Rubio. He's still one of the most powerful politicians in the state of Florida, right? And in the future might be actually a really good candidate to be governor. So just for context, like even if we had a large scale of high schoolers, we're not really going to be able to change anything unless we relate to other organizations outside ourselves that organize different sectors. And what we want to do as our organization is to experiment with really being useful into the broader movement ecosystem. Can we train high schoolers up to actually understand organizing, to actually understand strategy and base building? And what's putting us in a position right now, I'll end with, is it's requiring our organization to restructure our timelines, how we think about leadership development in ways that are actually against the typical way we've been able to get funding, which is like have a young person tell an amazing story, and then funders are like, wow, Power U is doing great work because this one young person told their own personal story really well. Let's cut them a check. So we're trying to build something that actually cuts against the current status quo of how organizations actually grow to scale financially.
That's great. Thanks, James. So panel, we have a few minutes before we're gonna cut to breakout groups. So just so folks know what's coming up in a couple minutes, we're actually gonna break you all out into small groups and give people an opportunity to reflect on what's resonating. So I'm just wondering, James, Jonathan, or Rachel, if there's anything else you wanna kind of throw in based off of what one of your co-panelists brought up.
No, I think that's right. I can really resonate with James's experience, particularly around the stuff we were trying to do to shift federal policy. And we quickly realized we were not big enough. We thought we were big. We like 33 groups. We rocking it, 12 states, 14 cities. Wasn't enough, right? And kind of got lucky on the other end in terms of the kind of a really bland and blanche federal policy. But now we find ourselves at the at the clutches of DeVos, who has spent the last 3 years kind of stripping Black students and oppressed students, LGBTQ students of their rights. And we have been powerless to stop or even disrupt this kind of stripping away of students' rights in education. So I think there is a real come to a real reckoning moment around kind of what we're doing and what shifts we need to make. And as powerful as narratives aren't necessarily enough in and of themselves to build what it is that we need to build to really shift the conditions for young folk.
I guess building off of that, just like another example is, like the narrative around criminalization and prisons has changed a lot because of our movement. And now many people are questioning why does this country lock up more people than anybody else in the world? And mass incarceration is becoming unpopular. And what we've seen is in Florida is that the right has swooped in because they see, okay, this tough on crime approach, it's sort of ending, it's not popular anymore. They're swooping in to call for the same, some of the same things that we're calling for, but with really different solutions. So hey, oh yeah, we'll get rid of money bail, but instead we'll put everybody on an ankle bracelet to basically make you a prisoner in your own home. That then the private prison companies can make money off of. And so just in this same vein of us shifting the culture and kind of creating the conditions for the policy change, but then not actually being empowered to lead the policy change has seeded this whole territory where now in Florida, prison reform is literally being led by far right Republicans. And many of the things that they're putting forth are not real solutions. And are only going to further entrench criminalization in our communities. So it's really scary stuff.
James, any final thoughts before we transition to give people a chance to reflect in small groups? Cool. All right, so as a reminder, if you haven't done so already, please link your phone to your video. If you're called in separately, Mona just dropped a link to a Google form that has a little tutorial on how to do that so you can participate in your small group. We don't have a ton of time, but you're going to be in small groups. We have facilitators, representatives of the leadership team for the lab, along with a couple of FCYO staff people. And here is the question that we'd like you all to reflect on. So we just want to hear kind of what's resonating. So this is just to remind folks of the points of alignment. Again, this is listed on the youthpowerlab.net website if you want to pull that up in the course of the conversation. But here are just the kind of top line. These are the 3 of the main points of alignment. And just get into your small groups. We want to, if you're a funder or kind of an ally to youth organizing group, we want to ask you all to step up your listening in these small groups and really give space to let youth organizers step up in their reflections and just share what's resonating and also what major questions or concerns are coming up as you hear everything that's been laid out here, both around the points of alignment and the lab more broadly. And before we go, we are going to drop the link to the eval now. We'd really love to get feedback on how this webinar has been going. So we're going to drop the link now. We're going to drop it again before we officially close. And then when we come back from these small groups, we're going to transition to Q&A for people that want to stay on and ask us some follow-up questions. So with that, Eric, if you can go ahead and get people into their breakout groups. Hopefully people got some nuggets of reflection out there. I think what I would say is that if that just didn't feel like enough time at all, that means you're hungry for these conversations, you're hungry to dig in, then I strongly encourage you to organize your organization and apply for the lab. So again, thank you all for diving in with us on that. Monica, are you on the line? I'll pass it over to you to close us out.
Yep. Again, thank you all so much. We know your time is precious and away from organizing is precious. So we appreciate you being with us today and digging in. And we hope that you all check out youthpowerlab.net, which is our website and landing page for all of this work. We'll continue to update it and add resources as we continue to build it out. Again, the application launches today, so take a look at the application process. The deadline is December 20th, and we'll be notifying groups at the beginning of February. Also, again, please fill out the evaluation. Mona is going to re-drop it in the link right now. We really are interested in learning more about what's resonating, what's landing, what could be improved as we continue to plan the whole lab process for next year. So again, much gratitude, and gratitude to the leadership team, the folks at YUC, Poder en Acción, Power U, AEJ, and Dream Defenders. Just a lot of love for all the work you put into this, and folks that are also on our MPT. Again, for those of you that still want to stay in conversation and have questions, we are still here. So feel free. We'll be around for the next half hour to continue to converse with those of you that so choose to hang out with us for a little bit longer.
Monica, do you mind answering the question I asked you?
Yes. So for those, Maria, in our small group, Maria asked the similarities of this to our current cohort, which is our Pipelines to Power cohort. So for those of you that don't know, FCYO has a variety of different ways in which we engage in groups. Granting cohorts is one of them, and one of them is called Pipelines to Power. And, you know, Maria, I think that this whole process was connected to both the learnings that Hashim and folks were having as a crew within Pipelines to Power, and our hopes to engage more folks in those types of conversations. So it's going to be, you know, as opposed to 15 groups, this is going to be 70, and it's going to be a truncated amount of time. So you all have been engaging for a period of like 3 years. This is going to be a period of 6 months, and then hopefully launching into some experimentation and learning phase post. So there are some similarities, but some differences.
I just wanted to just suggest, I don't know, Hashim, how you feel about this, but I think it would be really great to somehow, some way within those 6 months, be able to connect what we're doing at Pipelines to Power to this particular group, because we're having similar conversations. And I would also suggest that at the next one, I forgot what this is called, Youth
Power Lab.
Youth Power Lab. I suggest that a lot of people have a lot of interest around policy and implementation of policy. I would suggest that we try to tackle that topic next time too, if we can.
Thanks, Maria. Do other folks have questions? If you don't want to like voice them out loud, you can also drop them in the chat. Go ahead, Tony.
My name is Tony. I'm from Girls for Gender Equity in New York City, particularly we're based in Brooklyn, New York. I had a few questions. One, so thinking about the Youth Power Lab, are there specific expectations of young people? Are they also going to be going to the convening, or is it specifically for folks from organizations that do work with young people, so youth workers, facilitators, et cetera, folks from the campaign or policy teams?
Yeah, I think if you, so we really are looking for youth organizing institutions that are both doing base building, campaign work, and come from an analysis grounded in race and class. So it's definitely geared towards groups that are organizing institutions that engage young people both in those processes and those strategies, but in their leadership as well.
Yeah, no, I know that. I think my question is more so asking, so would we example, so I'm one of the campaign leaders here and we work with our youth organizers. So would the convening be a space for myself to be in, or myself and the young person? Right,
that's a great question. So, you know, the process kicks off with both the webinars. And so I think one, we would like the same folks to participate from beginning to the convening. Two, definitely we want somebody from the organization that is in leadership So an executive director, somebody with decision-making power. And then I don't know that we fully, Hashim, like you can remind me if we fully have discussed, like we typically, when we do these things, invite 2 folks. And so in some instances that has been a young person, and in other instances it's been like an executive director and a youth organizer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think what I would add on to what I would say is I think the most important thing is that your organization is sending people that can engage in a really high level conversation that is thinking about movement strategy, organizational strategy, as well as how that plays out in the day-to-day operations and program of your organization. For some organizations, they have young members and leaders that can engage at that level of strategic, or have that level of strategic capacity because of how they've been developed and how long they've been in the organization. So we really, I think, are probably going to leave it up to the organizations to determine if you have young people who can engage at that level. And it's not like we're going to kick people out who can't. It's just to say that the space may not be as useful for them if there are certain kind of key pieces of knowledge or understanding that they don't have. And then, yeah, just to underscore this point around, at the very least, we want at least one person who's actually in a position, either has decision-making power or, you know, organizations share decision-making responsibilities differently, are significant influencers over key decision-making processes within your organization.
Thank you.
And who is the point of contact or the points of contacts for the process for applying? For
now, it's me. So you can send follow-up questions or comments that you have to hashim@fcyo.org. And my information is on the lab website, youthpowerlab.net.
Do we have other questions? Or just reflections? Will there be fiscal support? I saw something about fiscal support that popped up in the chat. Can somebody from our team like gather the questions?
Sure. Yeah, there's a question about how we'll be documenting what happens in Miami.
That's a good question. I think typically at our convenings and gatherings, we've done it in a variety of ways and haven't dug into the details of how we'll do it there. You know, both in relationship to kind of capturing conversation and note-taking, but as well as like video and pictures. So we'll probably come out with a plan moving forward around how to kind of capture content in the moment.
Is this also connected to, I know that FCYO is also releasing a like scope. I think Mona, you touched on this a little bit. I don't know if you're still on the call, at the National Coalition for Family Philanthropy, where you talked about there's going to be a release of like evaluations of like how youth organizing affects young people. Is this going to be like one of after this lessons learned, is there going to be like a report around how to better connect as organizations, or like how to do base building in a more powerful, you know, stuff like that? So I just wanted to know like what the plan is after this particular experiment, if we have that already.
So FCYO's 20th anniversary is next year. This is kind of connected but separate to that. So we have a whole suite of things happening next year, including a release of a field scan, which will put out the data of what's happening in the youth organizing field. We'll have some communications coming out. We're actually going to have a big kind of convening party celebration at the end of the year. So there's a whole other suite of things that are happening that are kind of interconnected to this, but not directly related. Eric, do we have any other questions?
Yeah.
I saw something about like fiscal.
Yeah, there's a question about financial support and scholarships to get people to the gathering.
Yeah, we should have made that clear on the webinar. All the costs of you know, flights, hotels, lodging, food, meals, all of that to get to the actual lab convening in May will be covered. So that all of that kind of part of the process will we'll cover for kind of folks that get into the lab process. I hope that answers that question. And then again, you know, we don't quite have the fund, you know, we don't have the exact plan yet, but hoping to leverage some dollars for some of the experimentation that happens post, but not necessarily, this is not a grant making initiative. Any other questions?
This is Charlene from Milwaukee. Question is, do organizations need to, because there's a lot of policy work that I hear, do they need to be a C4?
No. Mm-mm.
Oh, okay.
I have a question. I'm hearing this like desire to scale, obviously, and I'm curious if there's like a size of the organizing base that is desired in applicants.
No, and we're actually looking for kind of, you know, a diversity of sizes of groups and types of organizing for sure.
Yeah, and I would just say within that, I think just to underscore the point around base and scale, it's not to say that every organization needs to aspire to be thousands of members. There are really important roles for like really small, deep, almost like cadre level kinds of organizations within our movements. The
Right.
question is, how do we have an orientation towards our movements getting to scale? And do we all understand our role in the process of building to that? And are we aligned with an ecosystem of organizations that are thinking about questions of base at a much bigger scale?
Mm-hmm. Do folks have any other additional questions or even reflections or considerations? I mean, even from our leadership.
I didn't catch it. How many groups are you all looking to support?
We're going to bring 70 groups into the process.
7 or 70?
70, sorry, 70.
Okay. No, that's okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I have a question. This is Kayla from Charlotte. As I was telling Monica in the small groups, I'm working with an organization that's really just getting started in terms of organizing. And I wanted to ask you all what kind of tips or focus points would you all suggest, or books or any kind of guidance that you all could give me to kind of developing the structure that within the youth and then within the larger structure of the movement to be able to really make some things happen.
Mm-hmm. I think, well, one step, Kayla, is, you know, if you go to FCYO's website, we have a bunch of different resources on there that you could dig through, like webinars, writings, toolkits, all that might help to your process. I would also go to like AEJ's website, the Alliance for Educational Justice, and some of these other networks and alliances who have a variety of toolkits and tools that might help you in the process. And then, you know, potentially setting up one-on-one calls with a variety of folks that are actually leading that work would probably be helpful.
Thank you.
I see Jonathan nodding his head, so I'm also going to volunteer, Jonathan, to receive an email from me if you like to set up a one-on-one conversation.
Absolutely, I'm committed to helping. But I definitely, I think the FCY, if I could direct you, I would be like, look at the FCYO occasional papers. I think they've laid out great framework, offer some analysis around the history of youth organizing from wherever you're coming from. And then I think a lot of the groups, you know, they use the School of Unity and Liberation as a baseline for understanding how they're building their organizations. And I think you start there. And then Monica's right on. Observation and participation have been our best teachers. And so being able to get in with another group, figuring out how they do it, how the theory differs from the practice, it was going to help, you know, grow your organizing, get you real strong.
Thank you.
So I have a question in terms of the collaborative, it's Michael from New Jersey. In terms of the collaborative projects that you see coming out of this, do you see this as collaborating on common issues so that the folks who are focusing on education are working together, immigration topic issues or cross-topic issues in terms of methodology.
Shim, you want to take it?
I'm actually going to see if one of the leadership team folks has some thoughts on that, and then if not, I can take a stab at it.
Mm-hmm.
All of it. I think that's in the idea around the experimentation, right? And also really kind of drawing an assessment of where we are in our time, place, and conditions, and being asking ourselves, and what else, and what more, and what do we need to do? And so I think there's a wide variety of ways that we can think about coming at it.
Did that answer your question, Michael?
It sounds like this is a work in process, which is fine. I think it can evolve out of the meeting. I mean, the other organizing principles, folks who are doing very local or neighborhood work versus those who are doing larger community statewide or federal work. So there are a couple cross-cutting ways to organize this. I think it's important to think through.
Somebody's asking if it's possible to share the names of all the organizations on the call. Hashim?
I don't know. Because what we get is we can export a registration list, but that just says names and emails. So I don't think we'd be able to share a list of all the organizations that joined.
What I can refer people, we can't share that because we can't share groups' information without their permission, but we can, if you look on our website and look at the youth organizing landscape map, there are profiles of about 300 different youth organizing groups from across the country. And there's lots of information about those groups there. So that's a good way to find out about the groups, many of the groups that were on this call and many others.
I see in the chat, Julie, you're having some trouble accessing the Youth Power Lab website. Have other people tried opening the website unsuccessfully? No. Mona,
It works for me. Oh, really? Maybe it's my computer, but it's just saying like, oh, it's a Google page. It's like, oh, sorry, you don't have access to it, and it's trying to pull me to a Google site instead of like a website. But is there? What
does it bring you to? At least the Google site.
Yeah, could I share my screen with you real quick?
Sure.
Okay.
Julie, is it all right if I ask another question?
Yeah, what's up?
We're gonna, cool. So, hey, this is Zach from Integrate NYC in New York City. I just have a question about you've been talking about this leadership team, and it seems like obviously every group has youth in their organization, but to what extent have youth been part of the planning of this particular convening thus far? Or like, what is their role in the leadership team that's putting together the event? Or the process, really. It's an event plus process.
You want to take that, Monica, or you want me?
All right, James, anybody from the leadership team?
Yeah, I could jump in real quick. It's been mostly just the key leadership. So we haven't had youth directly participating in the leadership team meetings.
Thank you very much.
We have a question about the field scan and whether or not it's going to be done by the time we get to Miami. Mona, do you want to chime in on the update and timeline of the release of the next field scan?
Yeah, the field scan will probably drop closer to the summertime, so June or July.
Are we good on the website? Did we have any follow-up for that?
Yeah, I got it to work. Mona was helping me out, and I was using it on Google Chrome, which was giving me a lot of issues. So they suggested that I try it on another browser. Tried it in Safari. Safari worked.
I wonder if we're going to that.
Actually,
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for helping me out.
Any other questions, thoughts, concerns, excitement? I like the excitement dance. I'm all for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say that we're really, really excited because this is really exactly where we are in terms of we just had some wins, and now the question is implementation. And to know that so many folks are asking that question feels like just really right for us to be in brain trusts with some people, but also then like beyond just the implementation of the policies we've won, that long-term accountability, power shifting that's going to be necessary to live beyond the scope of our small organization. So just really like the alignment is insane, and just really excited and also so inspired. You know, sometimes that there were like 100 people on this call at the beginning. It's really beautiful to be reminded of just how many of us are doing work in these different spaces. And I wish that I was talking to each one of you for like 3 hours, but.
All right, I think we can call it there. Appreciate everyone for taking this time and engaging with us. And if you are a youth organizing group, strongly encourage you to apply, share with other groups that you work with that you think are ripe for this kind of opportunity. If you are not a youth organizing group, but you're fund youth organizing groups or you partner with other youth organizing groups, please help us get the word out. Share the link to the website, have people read the criteria, read the points of alignment, and help us build buzz around this.
And the webinar will be up as well.
Great.
Thank you all. Thank everybody.